whole series of angles that I hadn't frankly thought about. And then one of them is, frankly, is this even an issue? Aren't we in a better position? Isn't it what happens in civilized, affluent societies that birth rates are lower, and that's actually a good thing? Is this a real problem at all?
Well, putting on my demographic hat for a minute, demographers use this magic number of 2, sometimes 2.05, 2.1, as a kind of a special number. It's the number above which 2 children per woman or per couple, above which a population will grow, even modestly. Your births are about 2.5 or 3, below which your population will eventually shrink. This number is called the replacement rate. Over the course of the last couple of 100 years, we can take the United States, we would say go back to about 1800, and the birth rate has come down from about 8 children per woman to, now below 2.
It's almost unimaginable. It's like 8 children per woman was the average?
Was the typical number of children, right? I mean, this is an average, yeah. But that is an enormous decline, and it is a decrease, and it comes along with many of the things that I think the ordinary person would consider good. Economic growth, industrialization in the best sense, progress, let's say reductions in child mortality. I mean, those are terrible things to have, and so we could think about that high birth rate as reflecting not all of those children survived to adulthood. More productive society in the sense that each worker is able to add more value, more productivity to the society, so you don't need as many workers. And so in a broad and global sense, the reduction of birth rates, and I'm not saying it's the reason, but in a broad and global sense, the reduction of birth rates from about 8 down to about 2, we'll say it goes along with lots of good things, right? And so, all right, so what about this magic number of 2? Well, where we are now is we're going below 2. This is not something that really the experts predicted or believed would likely happen, because so much of the focus was on kind of what do we do about these exploding birth rates, and that's people with old enough to remember can remember the time when the concern was that people had too many children.
Of course, with the population bomb and all that, there's still people that believe this, right?
There are still people who believe this. I get emails on a regular basis from quacks around the world who say, shame on you for the work that you're doing. There's still too many people in the world, so that is still present. But you asked the question, well, what about, is this really a problem where we are today? And the reason it may be a problem, and we should at least raise the question, is because the things that I mentioned, economic growth, rises in productivity, we don't believe those things can occur with a shrinking population. And so sustained birth rates below 2 for generations upon generations will lead mathematically to countries and nations, and ultimately the globe, as we are really on that precipice now, shrinking its population.
But if I can add a little bit on here, I mean, the way that that's being mitigated, for example, in the U.S. and frankly many liberal democracies, is through immigration.
That's right.
Right?
That's right. And that has been the mitigation for quite some time. I think the assumption has been that would be okay, that it would kind of balance itself out over time. There'd be kind of low birth rate countries welcoming immigrants from all over the place with high birth rates, and that, we're not going to ask questions about what happens in 50 or 100 years, but that's been maybe just an unspoken settlement that countries with low birth rates have been happy to have. But as lots of people have pointed out recently, Elon Musk fairly recently, the immigrants aren't going to be there in the future, because what we call a convergence to low birth rates is really the iron fact of modern demography. So all around the country, the countries that you might have thought, they're still having 8 or 9 children per household in that country. That's just not true anymore.
Well, and so now we come to what you call the Gordian knot.
Yeah.
In your book, why?
Yeah.
I mean, this is you're trying to address this. So lay out to me what people have thought, and of course you do this very well in the book. What people have thought are the reasons, and then some other things that you've happened upon.
Yeah. So maybe I'll take a step back and say, one of the things that I learned in this process was that we should not be so sure that we can count on people wanting children. And so it raises that question: why do people have children, and where do they come from? Going back to 1800, when people had 8 or 9 children per family, we don't need children as much as we used to, and so that sounds rather utilitarian. Do people just have kids because they needed them? And that raises this deep question about why people do anything or why they choose anything. And I think fundamentally they choose things because they want them or need them. And children are pretty useful to have in a time when societies are trying to sort of make ends meet, if we'll put it that way. It's really difficult for us today to imagine the kind of economic deprivation that most people lived with 200 years ago. So in those days, children were labor, they were help. Imagine if you don't have running water and somebody has to go bring water in from the well. Having an extra pair of hands is really helpful. We don't even need to sort of expand on, well, kids are labor on the farm. I mean, they are labor on the farm. But simple things like doing the dishes and getting the water, all of those things, more hands make life easier, right? And what's happened over the last really 200 years is that all of those types of things where you'd say, well, more hands obviously makes life better. We don't need children for those things anymore. The other big thing we used to need children for was support in our old age, right? And of course, you can point to a number of things, but really kind of New Deal style, large government programs, universal pension programs really reduce the need for the typical family to think about children as a way to support yourself in your old age. Of course, we have to confront ultimately also the change in sort of sexual reproductive technology that was in the 20th century, because all of a sudden you can couple up all you want, and children are not necessarily the byproduct of that coupling up. Scholars sometimes call it the contraceptive revolution. The pill and legal abortion kind of does this thing where there's to say maximum control to time and plan your births around your career and the other wants that are in your life, right? So together, the 1960s is the major inflection point of married mothers going into the workforce, and the opportunity cost of having children increases dramatically. Ceteris paribus, we should see fewer children.
You described the trend and the reality.
Yeah.
I guess as a train wreck. So why is it so dire?
Yeah.
Given our modern sensibilities and the incredibly prosperous. And people often forget about this because, of course, there's a lot of social strife, but we live in a unbelievable time of prosperity where there's a whole lot of things which are huge issues for people even a century ago, certainly two, are just not.
Yes.
Right.
So why is it a big problem? I would like to say there are 3 reasons it's a big problem. There are economic reasons, political reasons, and kind of human reasons. You cannot have economic growth without population growth. No, you don't have to have 8 children per family to have economic growth. But if you have a shrinking population, there are just not people to do all the jobs. Some people will say, well, what about AI? What about robots and things like that? That is probably a facile answer. I mean, at the end of the day, if you like being able to drive up to the Starbucks and have a coffee in the middle of your road trip, we need people to staff these things. So we don't know what the economy will look like with shrinking population. But I mean, when you think about like a town in the middle of the Rust Belt that's been kind of emptied out of people, and when you go through that town and you say, oh yeah, over there that was a fast food joint, but it hasn't been open for 20 years and it looks kind of terrible. Even today, we know that most of the government projections, when they score the impact of bills here in Washington, we know that they incorporate and assume a much higher birth rate than we have. So economic impacts, the political impacts, now I have to speculate a little bit more, but we are going to see, I think, increasing political instability over the question of identity. I mean, to put it simply, these kind of nationalist questions that are on the table. We see this certainly today at play, like what does it mean to be a nation? All these kind of questions, which I can't answer, but I think part of why they stress people out is because when you're a shrinking population, you do have to kind of deeply wonder if your way of life or who you are is going to go away. Setting aside the dysfunctions in the immigration system, and those are legitimate matters of political debate, it doesn't surprise me at all that when people are worried about whether their own way of life or their own nationality may disappear in the future, they would see immigration as a bigger threat. And the third thing is kind of a human reason to be worried about low birth rates. You know, when I was a kid, people used to write about it. They would say in Japan, nobody has cousins. And in Japan, nobody has brothers and sisters. And they would say this about, you know, it was like this, there were these lone places. But what I grew up with as described in a few isolated, you know, maybe Asian or Western European countries, Spain, that is today the global reality. It's where everybody's going. They will have fewer and smaller kinship networks. And so it's led some people to speculate about whether one of the reasons we see so much investment in political identity today, and you know, we'll say larger identity politics in general, is because our own kinship identities are shrinking. We don't come from clans or tribes. We don't have extended families the way we used to. You know, we don't have you know a dozen crazy aunts and uncles. And so there's some kind of human loss there that I think is difficult to calculate. It's a more atomized society, right? So there's a bunch of people out there, but you're not related to them, right? So that raises questions about loneliness, atomization, individualism, the types of things that I think people are wondering about today.
Well, and the other sort of, I guess, obvious question, obvious to me, because this is what I keep thinking about, is secularization.
Yeah.
And how does that fit into this picture?
Right.
Because, you know, for example, every single one of the women that you, the 55 that you interviewed for this project was religious. And that's actually also a question. I mean, why is that? How did that happen? Why didn't you interview the non-religious women with large families?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's two parts of your question. I looked for them. Now, this isn't this is a small qualitative study, meaning if you want to do 2 or 3 hour interviews with people, you can't interview thousands of people. But in my search for women to interview, I did look for secular women. In fact, I talked to and called the National Atheist Association, or one of the National Atheist Association. Who in your database do you have for me who has a number of children that I could interview? And they came back to me and they said, we couldn't find anybody. I said, okay, I'm not super surprised. So how does secularization fit into this picture? Religious faith, particularly biblical faith, provides a very strong want value for children. It gives us a basis for wanting children, right? So now children are blessings from God. They have spiritual value. You know that the relationship you have with your child will last forever. These are all things that are built into that religious package. A culture that's rising in secularity will be falling in the want value of children. So I think that's the story of secularization.
Fascinating. Well, there's also another element that I hadn't thought about until just now, and that's even in my extended family, there's people who really want to have children, but it's actually very hard. Like fertility actually has gone down itself.
That's right.
Never mind the ability to stop it.
That's right.
Right?
Yes, that's right.
So,
yes.
Then people, I guess a lot of people don't mind, but some people do.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
Yeah, so that's an important thing to talk about. So we know that it has become increasingly common that couples would suffer infertility. We do not think that medical infertility is the lion's share of the decrease in birth rates. It's across the globe, but I think it's always important to talk about the fact that that's increasing. A piece of what we call medical infertility, of course, is we have to always separate the incapacity of a man or a woman to conceive or to generate a child, which could be a result of medical deficiencies or other problems or hardships. But another piece of, we'll say, medical infertility is trying to have children at too old of an age for your biological makeup. So we know that there's a fertility sort of sweet spot for women, especially. And for women, that sweet spot really is in their 20s, right? So women are really highly fertile in their late teens, their early 20s, and that really starts to decline already by the mid-20s. It's starting to decline and then into the 30s. Most people are vastly unaware of that. So what we've done is we've shifted marriage to around the late 20s, early 30s, socially, right? That's the socially acceptable time to get married. So a piece of what we think of as medical infertility today is getting the timing wrong for the life cycle, the female life cycle.
Catherine, we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back.